London, 1851, and the conservatory of the Dashwood townhouse in Mayfair stood like a crystal palace at the edge of the world, its glass walls fogged with the unseasonable warmth of late April and the breath of a woman learning to die without making a sound. Lady Emmeline Dashwood pressed her hand against her mouth with such force that her teeth cut into the soft flesh of her lower lip, the taste of copper blooming on her tongue as tears streamed down her face in absolute silence, each drop falling like a stone into still water, making no ripple, no disturbance, no evidence of the catastrophe unfolding behind her ribs. She was 26 years old and had perfected this particular skill over 2 decades of careful training, the art of weeping without sound, without movement, without any outward sign that might disturb the perfect surface of propriety that her mother demanded like other women demanded tea at 4 o'clock. Through the glass walls that surrounded her like a fishbowl on display, she could see the garden below where her betrothed, Viscount Edmund Whitmore, had his mouth pressed against the lips of her cousin Lydia, his hand tangled in those golden curls that Emmeline had always secretly envied, their bodies pressed together beneath the ancient oak tree with an urgency that spoke of practice, of repetition, of a passion that had clearly existed long before this moment. The candlelight from the ballroom behind her cast dancing shadows across the conservatory floor, illuminating her mother's prize orchids that surrounded Emmeline like beautiful prisoners. Exotic blooms imported from the far reaches of the empire, each one requiring such perfect conditions to survive. Too much heat, and they withered. Too much cold, and they died, never allowed to simply exist without constant vigilance and control. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, thick and cloying, sickly sweet in a way that made her stomach turn, and she knew with terrible certainty that she would never smell that particular fragrance again without remembering this exact moment, this precise configuration of pain. Her other hand gripped the iron frame of the conservatory door, knuckles white against the dark metal, holding herself upright through sheer force of will, because ladies of quality did not collapse, did not swoon, did not make unseemly displays of emotion even when their entire future crumbled before their eyes like sand castles before the tide. Edmund's voice drifted up through the open window, clear and unconcerned, speaking words that carved themselves into her memory with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "Emmeline is biddable and rich," he said to Lydia, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather or the quality of the wine being served inside. "You are beautiful and exciting. Why should I not have both?" The casual cruelty of it stole what little breath Emmeline had managed to retain, and she watched as Lydia laughed, that tinkling sound that men always found, so charming, watched as her cousin, her own blood, looked up at Edmund with adoration and asked, "When we marry, will you still keep me?" Edmund's response came quickly, practiced, as though he had considered this question before. "Marriage to Emmeline is a business arrangement," he said, brushing a golden curl from Lydia's face with a tenderness he had never once shown his intended bride. "You are my pleasure." Inside the ballroom, guests laughed and toasted, celebrating an engagement that Emmeline now understood was nothing more than a financial transaction, her worth measured not in her accomplishments or character, but in the size of her dowry and the desperation of her family's debts. She could hear them through the walls, the cream of London society, toasting her happiness, congratulating her mother on such an advantageous match, never knowing that the bride stood mere feet away, dying silently while they drank champagne and gossiped about other people's misfortunes. This was not the first time Edmund had humiliated her, Emmeline realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins. But it was the first time she had witnessed it so directly, so undeniably, without the buffer of rumor or the softening lens of her own desperate hope that he might somehow transform into the husband she deserved. For months, she had heard whispers about his visits to certain establishments, about late nights at gambling hells, about debts that mounted faster than his allowance could cover, but her mother had dismissed such concerns with a wave of her hand, insisting that all young men sowed wild oats before settling into marriage, that Emmeline's role was to provide stability and respectability while turning a blind eye to masculine indiscretions that were, after all, simply the natural order of things. A memory flashed through her mind with the violence of lightning, bright and painful and impossible to ignore. Herself, at 8 years old, standing beside her father's grave as rain poured down and grief tore through her small body like a physical force, the sound of her own wailing echoing across the cemetery until her mother's hand cracked across her face hard enough to knock her sideways, the sharp command cutting through her tears. "Dashwoods do not wail like common servants," her mother had hissed, gripping Emmeline's arm hard enough to bruise. "You will be silent, you will be still, and you will comport yourself with the dignity befitting your station." The lesson had been reinforced again and again throughout her childhood, each display of emotion met with punishment, each tear earning disapproval, until Emmeline learned to swallow her feelings like bitter medicine, to compress her pain into something small and manageable that could be hidden away where no one would ever have to acknowledge its existence. "Breathe," she told herself now, the internal mantra automatic after so many years of practice. Silent. Still. No one must know. Her chest heaved with suppressed anguish, her entire body trembling with the effort of containing the scream that wanted to tear itself from her throat. But no sound emerged, not even a whimper, because she had been so thoroughly trained in the art of suffering quietly that it had become as natural as breathing. The fog on the conservatory glass grew thicker with each silent sob, her breath creating clouds of condensation that obscured the garden scene below, a small mercy that allowed her to finally close her eyes without seeing the ongoing embrace, though the image was already burned into her mind with perfect clarity. She had spent her entire life preparing for this marriage, had molded herself into exactly the sort of wife a man like Edmund Whitmore would need, accomplished in all the appropriate arts, fluent in French and Italian, able to manage a household with efficiency and grace, trained in watercolors and pianoforte, and the precise gradations of courtesy required by every possible social situation. And yet none of it mattered, because she was not young enough, not beautiful enough, not exciting enough to inspire the sort of passion that Edmund reserved for women like Lydia. The orchids surrounding her seemed to mock her with their fragile beauty, each bloom perfect and precisely maintained, just as she had been groomed and cultivated for this singular purpose, to be a decoration in some man's house, valuable only as long as she remained beautiful and quiet and required nothing that might inconvenience the people around her. Her lip continued to bleed where her teeth had broken the skin, a tiny rebellion of the body against the iron control she maintained over everything else. And she tasted salt, mixing with copper as tears ran into her mouth, evidence of her weakness that she quickly swallowed down, erasing the proof of her pain as thoroughly as she erased the sound of it. Beyond the conservatory walls, the party continued in blissful ignorance, her mother holding court in the ballroom, no doubt regaling guests with stories of the advantageous match she had secured for her difficult daughter, the one who read too much and thought too much, and had never quite mastered the art of simpering charm that came so naturally to girls like Lydia. Edmund and Lydia remained in the garden, and Emmeline wondered with a detached sort of curiosity how long they would stay there, how long until someone noticed their absence, whether anyone would think to look for the bride herself, standing alone among the orchids like one more exotic specimen in her mother's collection. The jasmine scent grew stronger, or perhaps she was simply more aware of it now that it had been consecrated by catastrophe, transformed from mere fragrance into a permanent memorial of this moment when she understood with perfect clarity that her life would be exactly what she had been raised to expect. A beautiful cage, a silent suffering, a slow death by inches while maintaining a pleasant expression and appropriate posture. She wanted to scream, wanted to shatter the glass walls around her and let the broken shards rain down like tears made solid, wanted to run into the garden and demand that Edmund explain how he could kiss another woman on the night of his own engagement celebration, wanted to slap Lydia's beautiful face and ask how she could betray family so casually, but instead she stood perfectly still, hand pressed against her bleeding mouth, tears flowing in absolute silence. Because this was what she had been trained for. This was the purpose of every lesson and punishment and careful correction, to create a woman who could endure anything without disturbing the peace of those around her with unseemly displays of emotion. The enormity of it settled over her like a physical weight, the understanding that this moment was not an aberration, but a preview, that if she married Edmund Whitmore in 3 weeks as planned, she would spend the rest of her life standing in metaphorical conservatories, watching through glass walls as he pursued his pleasures elsewhere, while she maintained the fiction of a proper marriage, producing heirs and managing households and attending social functions with a pleasant smile that never wavered, never revealed the screaming silence that lived inside her bones. But for now, in this moment, in this glass prison filled with carefully controlled beauty and the sickening scent of jasmine, Lady Emmeline Dashwood did what she had been trained to do since childhood. She breathed, she remained silent, she stayed perfectly still, and she let no one know that behind her calm exterior she was dying without making a sound. The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in gilt-framed mirrors that lined every wall, creating an infinite multiplication of the scene, of the guests in their finest silks and jewels, of the champagne fountains and elaborate floral arrangements, and most cruelly, of Emmeline herself, trapped in glass over and over again, each reflection showing a woman she barely recognized, powder carefully applied to hide the redness around her eyes, posture perfect despite the trembling that lived beneath her skin, a smile fixed in place like something painted on porcelain. She had taken 15 minutes in the conservatory after Edmund and Lydia finally separated and returned to the house through different entrances, 15 minutes to transform herself from a woman dying silently among the orchids back into the perfect bride, using the small compact she always carried to repair the damage tears had done to her complexion, biting her already wounded lip again to bring color back to her face, pressing cold fingers against her closed eyelids to reduce the swelling, breathing in measured counts until her heart rate slowed to something approaching normal. Lady Catherine Dashwood found her the moment she re-entered the ballroom, her mother's thin fingers wrapping around Emmeline's arm with a grip that looked like maternal affection but felt like iron manacles, nails digging into the soft flesh above her elbow hard enough to leave crescent-shaped marks that would bloom into bruises by morning. "There you are, darling," her mother said, voice honey-sweet for the benefit of the guests who turned to look at them. "I have been searching everywhere for you. The Duchess of Tilney is most eager to offer her congratulations." Emmeline allowed herself to be steered across the ballroom floor, her body moving automatically through the familiar motions while her mind floated somewhere above the scene, watching with detached curiosity as she curtsied to the Duchess, as she smiled and nodded and offered all the appropriate responses to questions about wedding preparations and future plans, her voice steady and pleasant, giving no indication that 20 minutes earlier she had witnessed her betrothed kissing another woman with a passion he had never shown his intended bride. The Duchess of Tilney, an imposing woman of 70 with diamonds dripping from her neck and ears, looked Emmeline up and down with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating livestock at market. "You have done well, Catherine," she pronounced to Lady Catherine, ignoring Emmeline entirely, as though the bride herself were merely another decoration in the room. "The Whitmore connection will restore your family's standing considerably, though I must say I am surprised Edmund settled on this one when the younger girl is so much prettier." Emmeline felt her mother's grip tighten painfully on her arm, warning her to remain silent, to absorb the insult with grace, to maintain the pleasant expression that was expected of well-bred young ladies who knew their place. "Emmeline has other qualities that recommend her," Lady Catherine said smoothly, her voice never wavering despite the cutting nature of the comment. "She is biddable, sensible, and has been trained to manage a great household, qualities that matter far more in a wife than mere prettiness, which fades with time." The Duchess nodded approvingly, and Emmeline stood perfectly still, a specimen on display, while the two older women discussed her merits and deficiencies as though she were not present, as though she had no thoughts or feelings about being described as biddable and sensible, as though the reduction of her entire existence to her usefulness as a wife and household manager was perfectly natural and required no acknowledgement of the person trapped inside this role. Edmund returned to the ballroom some 30 minutes after Lydia had slipped back in through the terrace doors, his cravat slightly askew, his hair mussed in a way that suggested fingers had run through it, his colour high and his eyes bright with the satisfaction of recent pleasure, and when he caught sight of Emmeline across the room, he smiled at her with easy confidence, clearly unconcerned that she might have noticed his absence or drawn any conclusions from it. He crossed, too, her side with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once been denied anything he wanted, and Emmeline watched him approach in the mirrors, seeing the scene multiplied endlessly, Edmund reaching for her hand, Edmund bowing over it with exaggerated gallantry, Edmund tucking her arm through his and leading her toward the centre of the ballroom where space had been cleared for dancing. The orchestra struck up a waltz, the music too loud, pounding in her head like a heartbeat, and Edmund pulled her into the dance with hands that gripped too tightly, his palm pressing against her waist with possessive force, his other hand crushing her fingers in his grasp until she could feel the bones grinding together. "You look lovely tonight, my dear," he murmured, pulling her closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough that she could smell brandy on his breath and something else, some feminine scent that clung to his coat. Jasmine, perhaps, or maybe she was imagining it. Maybe the scent from the conservatory had embedded itself so deeply in her senses that she would smell it everywhere now, a permanent reminder of her humiliation. She said nothing, merely maintained her pleasant expression and followed his lead through the steps of the waltz, her body moving mechanically through the familiar pattern, while her mind retreated to that floating place above the scene, watching this woman in pale blue silk being steered around the dance floor like a puppet whose strings were pulled by unseen hands. "I have been thinking about our wedding night," Edmund continued, his voice lowering to a whisper meant only for her ears, his breath hot against her temple. "I hope you understand what will be expected of you, what a wife's duties entail. I trust your mother has explained the particulars, though I find the innocent ones often require more forceful instruction." His hand slid lower on her waist, skating the edge of impropriety, and Emmeline felt tears gathering behind her eyes again, hot and unwelcome, but she blinked them back, breathed through the tightness in her chest, kept her smile fixed in place because crying would draw attention, and attention would displease her mother, and displeasing her mother would result in consequences she had learned long ago to avoid. "I am sure everything will be as it should be," she replied, her voice perfectly modulated, giving away nothing of the horror and disgust churning in her stomach at his crude implications. At the promise of violation disguised as marital rights. Edmund seemed pleased by her response, by her compliance, by the absolute certainty that she would accept whatever he chose to do to her without complaint or resistance. And he pulled her even closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body through the layers of fabric separating them, close enough that anyone watching would note the intimacy and smile approvingly at the evident passion between the engaged couple. As they turned past one of the large mirrors, Emmeline caught sight of her own face and was startled by what she saw. The pleasant smile was still in place, perfect and practiced, but beneath her lowered lashes, tears had leaked silently down her powdered cheeks, twin trails of moisture catching the candlelight as they fell. The Duchess of Tilney, standing at the edge of the dance floor, noticed the tears and leaned toward her companion with a sentimental smile. "Look at the dear girl," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "so overcome with joy that she weeps. How touching to see a bride so affected by her good fortune." Emmeline heard the comment and felt something crack inside her chest, some fragile thing that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. But her feet continued to move through the waltz. Her posture remained perfect. Her expression never wavered, because she had been trained too well, conditioned too thoroughly to break down simply because her heart was shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The waltz ended, and Edmund led her from the floor toward a small raised platform at the far end of the ballroom where a quartet played between dances, and with growing dread, Emmeline realized what was about to happen. Realized that Edmund intended to make some sort of announcement, though he had not consulted her, had not asked her preference, had simply decided as he decided everything, with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once considered that a woman might have opinions worth considering. He raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward them with curiosity and anticipation, and Emmeline stood beside him, her hand still trapped in his crushing grip, her face composed into pleasant attention, while her mind screamed soundlessly behind the mask. "My dear friends," Edmund began, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom, "I am delighted to announce that Lady Emmeline Dashwood has done me the great honor of accepting my proposal of marriage, and I am further pleased to announce that the wedding will take place 3 weeks hence, on the 22nd of May, at St. George's in Hanover Square." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, 3 weeks being unusually short, even by the standards of the day, suggesting either unseemly haste or impending financial necessity. But Edmund pressed on, undeterred by the whispers. "I find I cannot wait a moment longer than necessary to make this remarkable woman my wife," he said, the lie so smooth and practiced that Emmeline almost believed he meant it, almost forgot that less than an hour ago he had been kissing her cousin in the garden while describing their impending marriage as merely a business arrangement. She knew the real reason for the haste, had overheard her mother discussing it with the family solicitor just last week. The Dashwood debts were more severe than Emmeline had realized, creditors were circling, and the marriage settlement from the Whitmore family was desperately needed to stave off complete financial ruin. 3 weeks was not romance, but survival, not passion, but panic, not choice, but necessity. The guests applauded politely, and Edmund turned to her, clearly expecting some response, some pretty speech about her happiness and gratitude. And Emmeline felt every eye in the room fixed upon her, felt the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force, felt her mother's iron grip still on her arm, warning her wordlessly to perform her role perfectly, to seal this arrangement with appropriate sentiment, to make no trouble. She curtsied deeply, the movement automatic after years of training, and when she rose, her voice emerged steady and clear, carrying across the silent ballroom with perfect diction. "I am most sensible of the honor Lord Whitmore does me," she said, the words emerging as though from someone else's mouth, some other woman who was not dying inside this beautiful dress. And I accept with gratitude the arrangement our families have made. I trust that I shall endeavor to be a credit to his name and fulfill all duties expected of me as his wife. It was a speech calculated to please everyone, appropriately humble, properly deferential, giving no hint of reluctance or despair. And indeed the guests seemed satisfied, applauding again with more enthusiasm now that the bride had publicly accepted her fate. Lady Catherine beamed with triumph, Edmund looked smugly satisfied, and Emmeline stood perfectly still, smiling pleasantly, while something inside her withered and died. Some last small hope that perhaps there might be another way, another future, another possibility beyond this slow suffocation disguised as matrimony. As the orchestra resumed playing and guests pressed forward with congratulations, Emmeline found herself swept into a receiving line of sorts, shaking hands and accepting kisses on her cheek from people she barely knew, all of them offering wishes for her happiness while she mechanically thanked them, her responses automatic, requiring no conscious thought, leaving her mind free to drift away from the scene, to retreat into that quiet place where the pain could not quite reach her. Edmund had moved away to accept congratulations from his friends, and as she performed her social duties, Emmeline could hear fragments of their conversation, could hear Edmund's voice rising above the others in self-satisfied boasting. "She is plain but properly trained," he said, and Emmeline felt the words land like blows even as her smile never wavered. "The quiet ones are easiest to manage, you know. No tiresome dramatics or emotional outbursts. She will run the household efficiently and produce heirs without complaint, exactly the sort of wife a man needs when he wishes to maintain his freedom elsewhere." His friends laughed, offering ribald commentary about the benefits of a compliant wife, and Emmeline absorbed it all, each crude comment, each casual dismissal of her worth, each confirmation that she was nothing more than a convenient solution to his financial difficulties and her family's debts. A transaction rather than a partnership, a possession rather than a person. The evening stretched on endlessly, hours passing in a blur of champagne toasts and congratulatory speeches, and through it all, Emmeline maintained her composure, her pleasant expression never slipping, her voice never betraying the screaming silence inside her, until finally, mercifully, she was able to excuse herself to the ladies' retiring room, claiming a need to refresh her appearance before the final hour of dancing. The retiring room was blissfully empty, a small chamber off the main hallway decorated in soft pink silk with a chaise longue and dressing table. And the moment the door closed behind her, Emmeline collapsed onto the chaise, her legs finally giving out, her body folding in on itself as though trying to make herself as small as possible, small enough to disappear entirely. Tears came again, flowing freely now that she was alone, streaming down her face in total silence, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs that she dared not release even here, even in privacy, because the habit of silence was so deeply ingrained that she could not break it even when no one was watching. She stared at her reflection in the dressing-table mirror, seeing a stranger looking back, a woman in an expensive gown with elaborate hair and perfect cosmetics. A woman who looked like a bride, like someone anticipating joy, and the disconnect between the image and the reality was so vast that Emmeline felt dizzy with it, felt as though she were splitting in two, the performance and the person, the mask and the truth, the silent exterior and the screaming interior. Her mother's words from earlier that evening echoed in her mind, spoken in a moment when they had been briefly alone, low and vicious in Emmeline's ear. "You will marry Edmund Whitmore," Lady Catherine had hissed, fingers digging into Emmeline's arm hard enough to bruise. "Our family's debts require it. Your feelings are irrelevant. You have been raised for this purpose, and you will fulfill it." I will not allow your selfishness to destroy everything I have worked to preserve." Emmeline had understood in that moment, if she had not fully grasped it before, that there was no escape, no alternative, no possibility of refusal, because she had no money of her own, no skills that might allow her to support herself, no relatives who might take her in if she defied her mother's will, nowhere to go and no means of getting there. Even if such a place existed, she was as thoroughly trapped as if she had been locked in a cell, the bars made not of iron but of social expectation and economic necessity, and a lifetime of conditioning that had taught her to accept her powerlessness as natural and inevitable. She sat alone in the retiring room for perhaps 10 minutes, letting the tears flow in silence, making no sound, even though no one could hear her, because the silence was so deeply embedded in her bones that she no longer knew how to cry any other way. And when finally the tears slowed and stopped, she rose and repaired her face again, powdering over the evidence of her grief, painting her smile back into place, transforming herself once more into the perfect bride who would return to the ballroom and dance and smile and accept congratulations until the party finally ended, and she could retreat to her room and lie awake in the darkness, counting down the days until her wedding, until the moment when this beautiful prison would become permanent and inescapable, when she would be bound by law and custom to a man who saw her as property, as convenience, as something to be managed rather than loved. And there would be no more conservatory escapes, no more moments of private grief, only an endless performance of contentment while she died by inches, silently, invisibly, exactly as she had been trained. The first pale fingers of dawn were just beginning to reach through the tall windows of the Dashwood Library when Emmeline slipped through its heavy oak door, closing it softly behind her, as though afraid to disturb the sleeping books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines gleaming in the growing light, like 1,000 patient friends waiting to offer comfort that humans had failed to provide. She had not slept at all after the engagement party finally ended near midnight, had lain in her bed staring at the canopy above her while her mind replayed every humiliation of the evening in excruciating detail. Edmund's hands gripping too tightly during their waltz, his crude whispers about her wedding night, the casual cruelty of his conversation with friends where he described her as plain but properly trained, easy to manage, a convenient wife who would not interfere with his pursuit of pleasure elsewhere, and beneath it all, the image of him kissing Lydia in the garden. The passion in that embrace throwing into sharp relief the complete absence of any such feeling in his interactions with his intended bride. The library had always been her refuge, the one room in the sprawling Mayfair townhouse where she was allowed something approaching privacy, where her mother rarely ventured because Lady Catherine considered reading beyond the occasional novel a waste of time that might give a young woman inappropriate ideas about her place in the world. Here, surrounded by the smell of leather and paper and dust, by the weight of knowledge accumulated over centuries, Emmeline could breathe more freely than anywhere else, could allow her mind to wander beyond the narrow confines of what was considered appropriate for a lady of quality, could lose herself in worlds and ideas that had nothing to do with managing households or pleasing husbands or maintaining the sort of pleasant, undemanding presence that men, like Edmund, required in their wives. She had chosen a seat in the window alcove where morning light was just beginning to stream through the glass, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars, and she had pulled from the shelf one of her secret treasures, a medical text on human anatomy that she had hidden behind a row of poetry volumes years ago, knowing her mother would confiscate it if discovered, would lecture her about the unseemliness of a young lady studying the physical workings of the body, particularly the sections dealing with male and female differences that were considered far too indelicate for unmarried women to contemplate. This morning she had opened the book to the section on the human ear, fascinated as always by the intricate machinery of hearing, the way sound waves traveled through air and vibrated against the eardrum, setting in motion a chain of tiny bones with names like poetry, malleus, incus, stapes, hammer, anvil, stirrup, each one smaller than a grain of rice, yet essential to the miracle of hearing. The way these vibrations were then translated into electrical signals that the brain could interpret as music or speech or the rustle of wind through leaves. As she read, tears began to fall again. Silently as always, dropping onto the pages before her and blurring the careful anatomical drawings, but she made no move to wipe them away, allowed them to flow freely for the first time since the conservatory, since witnessing Edmund's betrayal, since understanding with perfect clarity that her future held nothing but a lifetime of silent suffering, of swallowing her feelings, of dying by inches while maintaining a pleasant expression that gave no hint of the screaming that lived inside her bones. She did not hear the library door open, lost as she was in her reading and her grief, did not notice the tall figure that entered until a shadow fell across her book, and she looked up with a start to find a man standing before her, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the morning wind, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that should have been unsettling but somehow was not, his expression one of concern rather than the polite indifference she was accustomed to seeing in men's faces when they looked at her. He was perhaps 32 years old, with strong features that missed being handsome by a narrow margin, but possessed something more interesting than mere beauty, a quality of presence and attention that made him seem more real, more solid than the parade of eligible bachelors she had been introduced to over the years, men who looked through her rather than at her, who saw only her dowry and her family name, and her suitability as a decorative addition to their households. The man made no sound as he approached, moving with a careful deliberation that she would later understand was characteristic of someone who could not hear his own footsteps, could not gauge the noise he made in the world, and he stopped perhaps 3 feet from where she sat, frozen in the window alcove, her anatomy book still open on her lap, tears still streaming down her face, though she had made no sound, had given no outward indication of distress beyond the moisture on her cheeks that caught the morning light like crystal. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook and a pencil, wrote something quickly, then held it out for her to read, his grey eyes never leaving her face, watching with that same intense attention as though he were reading something written in her expression that no one else had ever bothered to look for. The note said simply, in a bold, clear hand that suggested education and confidence, "I am Frederick Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth, and I apologize for intruding on your privacy, but I cannot help but notice that you are in distress, though you make no sound, which strikes me as the saddest thing I have witnessed in some time. May I be of assistance?" Emmeline stared at the note, then at the man, confusion and shock momentarily overriding her grief, wondering who this stranger was, and why he was in her family's library at dawn, why he was communicating through written notes rather than speech, why he had noticed her tears when every other person at last night's engagement party had looked directly at her weeping face and seen only what they expected to see, a joyful bride overcome with happiness rather than a trapped woman dying silently behind a mask of propriety. She took the pencil he offered and wrote beneath his words, her hand shaking slightly. "You are the Duke of Wentworth. Our families share a solicitor, Mr. Gardiner. He must have double-booked the library for meetings this morning. I apologize. I did not realize anyone else would be here. I will leave you to your business." She moved to close her book, to rise from the window seat and retreat to her room, but Frederick held up a hand, a gentle gesture that somehow conveyed both request and command, asking her to wait without words, and she found herself obeying, sinking back onto the cushioned seat as he wrote again, his pencil moving quickly across the page. "Please do not leave on my account," he wrote. "And besides, you have not answered my question. May I be of assistance? You cry like someone who has been forbidden to make sound, who silenced you." The directness of the question, the way it cut through all social pretense and demanded honest response, shocked Emmeline into something approaching truth. And before she could stop herself, before she could retreat behind the pleasant lies that usually shielded her from genuine interaction, she found herself writing, "I silenced myself. It was easier than being punished for noise. Ladies of quality do not make unseemly displays of emotion. I learned that lesson very young, and I learned it well." Frederick read her words, and something changed in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a tightness in his jaw that suggested anger on her behalf. And he wrote again, his pencil pressing hard enough into the paper that she could see the indentations on the page beneath. "Sound is not the only way to scream. I learned that when I lost my hearing at the age of 14, a fever that nearly killed me and left me deaf. At first I thought I had lost everything, that silence meant absence, emptiness, death. But I was wrong. Silence can be peaceful, can be chosen, can be a gift rather than a punishment, but the silence you carry is different. It is enforced, violent, a theft of your right to express yourself. Your face is screaming now. Did you know that? Even without sound, you are screaming, and I can hear you perfectly." Emmeline stared at the words, at this stranger who had somehow seen in 5 minutes what her own family had failed to notice in 26 years. That her silence was not serenity, but suppression. Not peace, but pain. Not choice, but coercion. And she felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she had built to protect herself from the knowledge of her own suffering. And fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, faster now, more urgent, though still without sound, still without the wailing that wanted to tear itself from her throat. Frederick watched her cry for a long moment, his grey eyes never leaving her face, reading her grief with the same careful attention he had given to her initial distress. And then he did something that shocked her more than anything else in an already shocking encounter. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingertips brushing against the wet trail of her tears. And then he held his hand up between them so she could see his fingers glistening with the evidence of her pain. He wrote again, one-handed now, holding his tear-dampened fingers up like proof of something important. "I may be deaf," he wrote, "but I am not blind. I see what others miss because I have learned to pay attention, to read faces and bodies and all the small signals that hearing people ignore because they are too busy listening to words, which are often lies anyway. Your tears are real. Your pain is real. And someone who taught you to hide it has done you a great cruelty." She wanted to defend her mother, wanted to explain that Lady Catherine had only been trying to prepare her for the realities of society, that learning to control her emotions had been necessary training for a woman who would need to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the aristocracy. But the words would not come, would not form themselves into the usual justifications and excuses, because looking into Frederick's steady grey eyes, she could not quite believe the lies she had been telling herself for so many years, could not quite maintain the fiction that her silence was strength rather than submission. Instead, she wrote, "How do you do that? How do you see what no one else sees? Everyone at my engagement party last night looked directly at me and saw a happy bride. They mistook my tears for joy. But you walk into a room and immediately know that I am dying inside. How is that possible?" Frederick smiled, a small, sad expression that suggested he understood more than she had said. And he wrote, "Because I have learned that the hearing world is mostly deaf to what matters. They listen to the sounds people make with their mouths, but ignore everything else. the tightness around the eyes, the set of the shoulders, the way someone holds their breath when they are trying not to break. I lost my hearing, but I gained something too. Clarity, the ability to see truth beneath performance. And you, Lady Emmeline, are performing magnificently while dying magnificently.